Report. Michael Brooks at the helm here. Joining us now is the legendary proprietor of the Informed Comment blog. He also teaches history at the University of Michigan and is the author most recently of Muhammad, Prophet of Peace. Professor Juan Cole, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Professor Cole, let's start with Israel. What's actually happening there? An election has been called. A sitting prime minister has been indicted. A left-wing party has been banned from running, even as even further far-right extremist and overtly racist parties enter the political process. What's your kind of broad read on the electoral landscape of Israel right now?
Well, Israel, for the past couple decades, has been trending not just right, but really far right in its politics. And, you know, in some ways, some of these trends are similar to what's happened in the United States. There's an enormous increase in inequality. A handful of billionaires really are running the show. It's getting hard for ordinary people to pay their rent in places like Tel Aviv. And then on top of everything else, you have a severe racial divide in Israel between Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Israelis. About, close to 25% of Israel is probably of Palestinian heritage. Often you see a statistic of 20%, but in any case it's very significant. And their party, the party that tends to represent them, Balad, which has also Jewish Israeli supporters, as you say, is a far left party. And it has just been banned from running by people like Avigdor Lieberman, the former Israeli defense minister, on the grounds that it's insufficiently loyal to Israel. That is to say that it's largely supported by the Palestinian Israelis. So this will be overturned by the Supreme Court. But the Palestinian Israelis really are increasingly checking out of the Israeli political elections, and this will probably also further hurt their turnout, which is what Lieberman wants. So it's a little bit like voter suppression in the United States, where laws are passed like ID laws and so forth to keep African Americans from voting. In Israel, the right has the luxury of just announcing it's not going to let their party run at all.
Now, some people who will defend the kind of resiliency of Israeli institutions, and look, I don't really see a contradiction between acknowledging sort of three things: that there's an occupation, there's a siege on Gaza. Those are both unspeakable violations of every kind of principle that you would hold if you had even just kind of basic democratic and liberal values. Then there's the the growth of Israel as an extreme far right state in the last decade even. And then there's the fact that there are still some mechanisms, certainly of democracy, that work, I guess, in some ways, and applied to specific things robustly. So how do you kind of balance out that calculation in terms of how to read and understand exactly what Israel is as a state, embodying all of these contradictions?
Sure. Well, as you say, things are on a spectrum. Within Israel proper, there are regular elections, and however, there's increasing signs of them not being entirely on the up and up. So I would say that, Freedom House has those three categories of not free, partially free, and free. And Israel is only partially free for many reasons. One is, again, these steps that are taken to limit the franchise of the Palestinian Israelis. But also within the Jewish Israeli majority, the corruption charges against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are not, in my view, just corruption. They're about the destruction of democracy. It's far beyond monetary corruption. He is charged with taking gifts from rich people to do them favors, which is ordinary everyday corruption that happens everywhere. But in addition to that, the casino mogul Sheldon Adelson in the United States started a newspaper in Israel, which is a cheerleading instrument for Netanyahu himself, and gave it away for free. You could just get it on the street corner and just pick it up for free. And it's a full newspaper. It has a staff. It does reporting, and so it was competing with real newspapers that were founded just to do news and not just to support Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is accused of going to one of the real newspapers and saying, look, I know your business is being hurt by this free rag we're giving out. We can print more of it or we can print less of it. If you're nice to me, we'll print less of it. So, right. Netanyahu is accused of shaping the reporting on him in the national press by blackmailing the newspapers with bankruptcy and using Sheldon Adelson's casinos as a piggy bank, essentially for his muscling of these newspapers. And there's more of that kind of blackmail and pressure put on these newspapers, because the government is in charge of licensing and so forth. So, I mean, they're calling it corruption charges, but they're really dictator charges.
Yeah, so that's right. That's really important. And I'd like you to actually compare and contrast. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was released from prison about a year ago on corruption charges. Olmert is certainly a much more charismatic and appealing personality than Netanyahu. He certainly presided over his own great crimes against Gaza and Lebanon as prime minister, but he also recognized rhetorically, and if you believe in a two-state solution framework, he certainly put on the table the most substantive offer of an actual two-state solution to the Palestinian leadership. And he suggests, one, he had a funny line that he felt bad for Netanyahu because of his delicate mental state, which was a funny sort of like he still knows how to throw a jab, but his claim is actually that the corruption charges that took him down, which were purely of the money in a shoebox to do a favor variety, were actually spearheaded by Sheldon Adelson and far-right forces in the United States because he was willing to buck the extreme right in Israel. So, maybe he's just justifying himself, but can you kind of compare and contrast the Olmert saga, where this guy actually did go to jail, and then the actual the much larger stakes of what Netanyahu is accused of, and then Olmert's claim that he essentially was corruption charges were the engine to move him out of the picture because he wasn't appeasing not only the Israeli far right, but he actually really points the finger at the American far right, which is fascinating.
Oh, sure. Well, the American far right is extremely influential in Israel, and indeed, now there's this big issue over AIPAC and its lobbying and giving campaign or directing campaign monies, directing other organizations to give campaign monies to American politicians to get them loyal to Israel. And the fact is that AIPAC doesn't represent, the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community leans left. 70% of them vote Democrat. The AIPAC represents a handful of extremely wealthy, very far right-wing Jews, and cooperates then with the right-wing evangelicals to generate messages to Congress and to the media and so forth. So the fact that the mechanisms for the Israel lobbies are in the hands of a right-wing group in the United States then has this enormous impact on Israel itself. I think that Olmert is just corrupt. He was taking money from, as you say, for favors, even going back apparently to when he was mayor of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And I think the Israeli police are some of the last uncorrupted institutions in Israel in this regard,
Right.
and they really are willing to indict a prime minister, which, as you suggested, it shows that Israeli democracy is not completely gone. And the fact that the Attorney General, who was appointed by Netanyahu, is willing to go forward with these charges against him is also a sign of the continued robustness of elements of Israeli democracy. But there are starting to be, as I said, these severe constraints on it that between the manipulation of the press and of press licenses and the corruption and the disenfranchisement of large numbers of voters and then the ongoing occupation. I mean, this is a very complex situation, and just calling it a democracy would be a misnomer.
How does this play out in the sense that, again, Olmert, I'll just, referring to him, he quite confidently predicted that Netanyahu will lose the election. He said that, parties from the center right through the left have been asking him for advice, which I guess is probably his stand-in for being sensible. But you could have a situation where it seems to me just as likely, if not more likely, that another even more extreme far-right coalition wins. Netanyahu's return to power with these dictatorial aspirations, and his response to these charges so far, in my read, has not been to deny them. I mean, he has denied them, but he's almost been asking for them to be crushed in an extrajudicial sort of process. I mean, how do you see that dynamic playing out?
Right. Well, with regard to the upcoming election, the polling suggests that Netanyahu's right-wing coalition will get 61 seats, which is a bare majority, and that Likud will be the largest party in the coalition, and that would mean that Netanyahu gets another term as prime minister. 61 is a very slim margin in a parliament of 120. And whether the far right will get that many is of course impossible to actually predict, and so there's uncertainty about this. There is a strong center right tendency, which is offsetting the far right to some extent. But it's been pointed out by my colleague Mark Tessler that in the last few elections, a center right always emerges and does relatively well, but then withers on the vine after the election and doesn't quite get to a majority. And there's kind of now, some of these things are ethnic, but there's kind of a constituency for the far right of various sorts: the ultra-Orthodox, the Eastern European and Russian immigrants, the Mizrahim, or the Jews originally from the Middle East itself. Mm-hmm. All of them tend to relatively far-right politics. So it's hard for the center-right to win.
What is the center-right now? Is Labor considered center-right now? Are we talking about Yair Lapid's party? What would be center-right now?
Yes. I'm calling Gantz and Yair Lapid as center-right. And I think it's in Israel they're called centrists, but I think they in American terms they would be center-right, or in European ones. Right. No, Labor is on the left, but Labor is a shadow of its former self. It doesn't amount to much.
Right. And then and what about Meretz? That would be the only.
They're done. Yeah. They're done. They're done. I met Shulamit Aloni years ago, and we got along fine. And I was joking with Israeli colleagues years later that if I were in Israel, since I liked Shulamit, maybe I'd vote for Meretz. But these were Israeli lefties, so they called me a running dog capitalist and imperialist for that. But Meretz, which is center left, those parties really just aren't able to get significant representation.
That's important to
in the Knesset
underline,
anymore.
right? Because Meretz is by Americans. I would deem labor to me is definitely in very much the center, as it were, and particularly with regards to things like the occupation. But Meretz, could be fairly deemed, I agree with you, a center-left party. And in the current Israeli context, I mean, they might as well be communists who want to live in one state. I mean, that's how far the pendulum has swung to the far right in Israel.
Yes. Oh, well, absolutely. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on how you measure these things. If you're looking at issues in wealth distribution, which is traditionally the way you judge whether something is left or right, then labor is left. They support labor unions and things, but which Likud does not. But if you get outside of internal Israeli politics and look at issues of occupation, well, labor engineered the occupation, so there's not that much difference between them and the right on that issue.
Ilan Omar has been speaking out on this. So, what's your read on that?
Yeah. Well, before we move to that,
please.
we should just mention briefly that one of the ways that Netanyahu hopes to get his 61 seats and a majority in the new parliament is that he's encouraged one of his coalition allies to bring on board a terrorist organization.
Yes.
The Otzma Yehudit, the Jewish Power faction of Kahanists, who, various forms of Kahanism, going back to Rabbi Meir Kahana, have been termed terrorists by the U.S. State Department, by the Israeli government banned them from running for office. Some of their members celebrate the massacre at the Tomb of the Patriarchs in 1994 by Baruch Goldstein, who shot down 28 innocent civilians, and a little bit the way that the Trump machine has, authorized support by the white supremacists in order to get a margin over the Democrats. So Netanyahu has authorized this coalition with the Kahanists. And one of their leaders who couldn't get into the United States for being considered a terrorist or a member of a terrorist organization has just been allowed to run by the Election Commission, which is controlled by the Likud, the ruling far right-wing party. So this is a very distressing development. Israeli politics is far right, but these people are crazy, and even the American Israel lobbies are upset, and I think they're afraid that this is increasingly a hard sell to the American public.
Right. And this is the other, actually, maybe we should put this on the table too. I mean, this is the thing that when leaders, again, like an Ehud Barak or an Ehud Olmert, would talk about the need to end, they meant it in different ways, but some form of ending the occupation, having a two-state solution, they would couch it, and they used the word apartheid before anybody else. A lot of they would couch it in those terms. They would say, look, American Jews, by and large, are, frankly, pretty liberal. They care about things like civil rights, and this just isn't tenable. But the new Israeli leadership has clearly made the calculation that, first of all, there's plenty, there's an extreme far right that opposes civil rights in the United States. There's resurgent neo-fascists in Europe, and then there's governments that you can do business with that don't even have, of course, in the United States case, it's obviously hypocritical and contradictory, but as an example, in China or Russia or something, there isn't even a kind of pretend human rights discourse. So you can just, go about your business. And if the liberals don't like you anymore, then, so be it. Seems to be the calculation.
That's right. Well, I think the calculation is that wealthy far-right billionaires are the ones you need to please, and they don't care about things like occupation. In fact, they're looking for ways to profit from it.
Right.